Welcome again to Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. It's a safe bet that anybody watching this show has seen a movie in a movie theater. Even in the days of streaming services taking off, almost everybody of any age has seen at least one movie in a theater, even if you're very young. But I also think it's a safe bet that most people who go to a movie in a theater have no idea how that movie ended up in the theater. Why that movie and not another? Why does this one play for a week and this one plays for one night? And so on. So joining me today is Josh Gray, who's Director of Creative Programming at the Dreamland here on Nantucket, and he will try to explain how this process goes. Josh, thanks for doing this.
Absolutely.
And before we get going, full disclosure, I'm on the board of directors of the Dreamland, and you and I together are the co-programmers of Film for Thought every Wednesday night, year-round at the Dreamland.
Yes.
So, rather than have a dry description of what goes on in general, why don't we pick a particular movie, and you can tell us the process from soup to nuts. So, my thought is Avatar: The Way of Water. When did you first know that that was going to be available to theaters?
Sure. So studios make it known what's coming out in the next few years. So we kind of have things on our radar, especially when we're planning budgets and things like that. We look at the year ahead and see what sort of titles are coming out. For those that don't know, Disney is the the gorilla in the room, and they kind of dictate the industry. So it's an ongoing relationship. When you play one Disney movie, you're pretty much you're compelled to play essentially every Disney movie. Disney is known to be very stringent with their rules, and the Dreamland, like any movie theater, is known to studios as an exhibitor. So their rules for exhibitors are very, like I said, stringent, and there's a lot of requirements that come with playing their movies. One of those requirements is what's called a clean designation or a clean screen. And that means when you get a movie like Avatar, they're going to tell you that you can only play that title on a certain screen for many, many weeks. And you can't play another title alongside it. For each calendar day you're open, a screen must be designated and dedicated to that particular title. So when we knew Avatar was coming up, we worked with a booker who's based in Boston, and he books, I think, roughly 25 exhibitors in the Northeast. And so he communicates with Disney directly, and then he's the go-between between Dreamland and the studios.
So you don't communicate directly with Dreamland, with Disney. Is that true for any movie theater of any size in the country, or just for the smaller ones?
It is true. I can't speak for the massive chains like AMC. They probably have a special department that deals with them because their programming is dictated nationwide. It's not just per theater. They may have certain titles that are more popular regionally that may play in smaller theaters in a multiplex like that. But for the most part, those big companies are just buying pictures to play in all their theaters, and they probably get a much better rate than an independent theater.
Now, in the case of Avatar: The Way of Water, first of all, when did it come out? And when did you sign up for however many showings you wanted to have, or however many they told you were going to have?
Right. So Avatar came out, I believe, on December 16th this year. And we put tickets on sale roughly a month before that. Because we were not a 3D-enabled theater, we were actually only allowed to play it on one screen. That's how much James Cameron really wanted people to have the 3D experience. So for theaters that aren't geared to have a 3D experience, that was sort of a drawback. We probably lost people coming to see it at the Dreamland because they were interested in seeing it having that 3D experience.
So to pick up on what you were saying a moment ago, they're dictating the number of weeks you could show that movie at the Dreamland.
Yes.
Which in this case was?
5 weeks. And then that's not always the final word, though. We ended up having to play it clean for 6 weeks. So it becomes very prohibitive for other titles when you only have two screens.
Now, did they tell you which of the two screens you had to show it on?
They do, generally speaking, because they don't get into the nitty gritty of each exhibitor, but they say your largest screen. So after a few weeks, I'm sure they're not as stringent with that, but for the first couple of weeks, we did have to play it exclusively in our main theater, and anything else we were playing was subject to be played in the smaller studio theater.
Would they get to the point of telling you how many times a day you could show it?
They do stop short of that outside of making sure you have an evening showing, a primetime showing, just because they know that, especially post-pandemic, a lot of movie theaters are understaffed and things like that. Even the Dreamland, which is now back open 6 days a week, for a couple years, once we'd reopened, we were only open 4 to 5 days a week, and we just kept scaling up. So they, of course, have to take that in consideration. They're not supplying, staff for us or anything like that, so they have to accept our open days. But yes, the days that we are open, they are very attuned to what's being played where.
And do they check on this? And if so, how do they do that?
They do. They just go on our website and they see what screen the movie's playing on that day, and they just make sure nothing else is playing on the same screen the same day.
Do you know that they do that? I mean, obviously they can do it, but how do they prove they've done that?
From time to time, I'll get a phone call from our booker, and they'll say Disney has called and wants to know why this looks like this. And, I always am ready with a good explanation. But they do. And we're dealing at Disney not with high-level management. We're dealing with people who are middle management, and they deal with a large number of theaters. And so while they do, that person is checking websites to make sure everyone's following the rules. I'm sure they have hundreds. Each person probably has 100 theaters, that they're in charge of.
And ticket prices. Obviously, the ticket price is dictated in part by how much you have to pay to get it. Mm-hmm. But not to pick on Disney, but does Disney or Universal or anybody, do they tell you what to charge?
No. So we charge the ticket price that our market can afford. A small movie theater in the Midwest is probably less expensive to go to a theater than it is in the Northeast. But what they do, and what all studios do, is charge a percentage of the ticket price. So Disney is probably the highest, at probably around 65% of every dollar goes back to Disney. And that can go down to as low as 35% for a different studio.
Now, when Disney takes 65% and Dreamland keeps 35%, but you're paying for the staff, so on and so forth, out of that 35%.
Right.
Now, they're also, out of their 65%, they're paying God knows what, but still, it's that's quite a chunk they're taking.
It is, and that's why movie theaters don't survive without their concession sales. And so that's a big part of Dreamland too, is, every time you go into a theater, and there's a good reason why theaters say no outside food or drink, it's because the theater really depends on those sales to make ends meet, especially with a studio like Disney that kind of takes back the lion's share of the revenue.
I remember years ago watching Gene Siskel, so this is decades ago, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert talking about the very thing you're mentioning. Mm-hmm. And Ebert said he was astounded to find out that in many cases, theaters make more money off of food and drink mm-hmm. than they do off of what's on the screen.
Yeah. And post-COVID, Disney's consolidated even more and more of the industry. So that's becoming more and more the case, where, the profit margin for an organization like ours is less and less because, even Top Gun last year, Paramount, that percentage, I believe, went up after they realized the success of the title. And so, it's always a moving target, and it's different for each movie. They set out to produce movies that they think will make the most money. But of course, that doesn't always happen. You have flops and things like that. And so the rules are bent if that is the case. We might only have to play a movie clean for 1 week if it's just a complete flop or something like that. But in the case of Avatar, it's now become one of the highest grossing films of all time. So Disney really was kind of holding exhibitors' feet to the fire and saying, you really need to play this as long as possible. We see it's still making as much, if not more, money than other titles on your screens, and so it's really just kind of playing their game for as long as they need you to play it.
But they will, just to pick up on a minute ago, if something is highly anticipated and is a dud, they won't necessarily hold you to the 2 weeks or 3 weeks or the.
Yeah, they might set out with a 2 or 3 week, like letting you know there's a 2 or 3 week clean period. But like I said, if it is a complete flop, they understand that it's probably not going to make much money, and so they are more willing to let you take it off your screens early and then make it up on the next one. So, for instance, we just stopped playing Avatar last week. And we have a few titles in there for the next few weeks that will get us to their next release, which is the new Ant-Man sequel, which is a Marvel movie, and those tend to do very well. And so that will once again probably have a 4 or 5 week clean period where we're left to program our second screen with whatever we can get that will be allowed to be shared with multiple titles. Because not every movie is clean. And it just, it's kind of a balancing act of playing what a large number of people want to see, what will make, some revenue, but then also balance it with thoughtful programming. That's why we have Film for Thought, is to make sure we always have room for documentaries and art house films. But we're playing a title, Living, right now with Bill Nighy, who was just nominated for Academy Award, I believe, for Best Actor. And so we are able to split that with another title. The new M. Night Shyamalan movie is coming out this weekend. So those two pictures will share a screen for the next couple weeks.
Let's talk about a movie that's not expected to be an Avatar or a Top Gun. If there's a movie that Hollywood thinks is going to do pretty well, but without being a blockbuster, is it the same basic rules that apply here, but on a smaller scale? They're not going to stick you with it for 5 or 6 weeks.
Right. So I think right now, post-COVID, because there are fewer titles than there were pre-COVID. You know what I mean? The industry shut down essentially for a couple of years. And so we're starting to see the return of regular, a production schedule. Whereas 21, 22, it was kind of few and far between. I would say what still hasn't recovered from COVID is a lot of the art house films, and then children's films as well. We probably only get a PG movie probably every 2-3 months now, or an animated title. And so we've been playing the sequel to Puss in Boots now since the week before Christmas. And that's really the only thing in theaters that we have available to play. We oftentimes will go back into the catalogs of older pictures and pick a popular, it's called repertory film, which is a film that's not in its first run in theaters. And we'll put that on screen. And so like a Moana or something like that, we could put that on the screen, and people, just because kids love that movie, they'll come out and bring the family and get some popcorn and candy and enjoy it on the big screen.
Well, it's a good point about COVID stopping the industry almost in its tracks. Not as many things were coming out in 2021, 2022, but if you want to go way back to when I was a kid, the Dreamland in the summer would have a different movie almost every single night.
Right.
And sometimes they would play for 2 nights, but never more than 2 nights.
Right.
And that would happen maybe once or twice a week.
Right.
So for the most part, it was a different movie every night, and nothing would come back.
Right.
The one night was it, the 2 nights were it. This was true into the 1960s. And the reason, of course, was, or one of the reasons, there were so many more movies being made back then than there are now.
Right.
There was much more to choose from. And audiences, of course, they'd go to the theater. They wouldn't sit home and watch it on TV.
Right.
But why do you suppose that is, that there are so many more were made than compared with today?
So I'm definitely not an expert on this subject, but I know what you're talking about. Like, for instance, like Edward G. Robinson movies, like noir, 1940s, 50s movies, gangster movies. I know they made them back to back to back to back all the time, and then they would just push them out to theaters, and people would go to see each one, and so that made money for them. But in the age of, I have a feeling this kind of more hardball type approach probably started in the early 2000s, and it's just as data became king, that's when this sort of mentality, I think, took over.
The movie Living, which you just mentioned, I don't think anybody anticipated that was going to be any kind of a big deal on any scale. Mm-hmm. But with Bill Nighy getting nominated, mm-hmm. the movie that wouldn't necessarily have done that well, all of a sudden people want to see it.
Right.
Now, I don't know exactly when you booked that, mm-hmm. but if you had booked that at the end of last year under certain terms, mm-hmm. if you've already made that agreement,
right,
can they pull the rug out from under you and say, well, now that things are looking rosy, we're going to charge you more? In other words, can they override a previous agreement?
Yes. Nothing is written in stone, and certainly we've experienced, you and I have experienced with Film for Thought, movies that start out as art house titles and then get major award nominations. They are often pulled back last minute because they recognize that without those nominations, they would not make very much money at the box office. But with those nominations and a potential win, they could then bring it to what's called a wide release. I should say that there is oftentimes a limited release where they only push a movie out to 500, 1,000 theaters, see how it does, and that ups their per screen revenue, which is a very important factor when studios are analyzing success of a title.
So what you're saying is, in some instances, the studios would rather not have the movie in theaters at all?
Mm-hmm. Or up to a certain point. So a good example is we were going to play Women Talking, which is a new art house picture. It's very much speaks to the age we're in politically, and through the Me Too movement and all sorts of the Supreme Court decision on abortion, things like that. So it's going to touch those keystone points. And going into theaters, they probably didn't expect a huge box office. It might be too dark, might be too political for them. And every movie has numerous test screenings, I would think, at this point. I can't say that's wholesale, but certainly any major studio is doing many, many test screenings with test audiences to see how people react. And they base through data how they roll out a release based on that. So, but in the case of Women Talking, that movie started to get awards buzz. And so at a certain point, they decided, well, what if we win Best Picture? Then all of a sudden we have a moneymaker on our hands. And so they want to make the most money per screen as possible. And so if they win that award, then they'll go a wide release with that title, and they'll probably do really well.
So it's not in a wide release as we're speaking?
No, it's only in, I was told last week that Women Talking was only adding 1 or 2 screens per week.
And yet, over the last week or two, I've seen tons of ads for it on television.
Right, but that's a campaign for the Academy Awards.
Interesting.
Yes.
Sort of, well, in a way, it's a stealth campaign, because you assume if you see an ad on TV,
right?
Excuse me, that's going to the potential customer, the consumer.
Right.
But you're saying it's
also
not as simple as that.
It's also affecting the Academy voters who are seeing the same commercials and maybe subliminally being influenced by that. I mean, that's my guess, but yeah.
Well, this reminds me of Glass Onion, which I believe it was in selected theaters for a week.
Right.
And then they took it out of the theaters, but they didn't start streaming it. For a month, you could not see that anywhere. Right. And then after the month, they decided to stream it.
Right.
And there was a piece in the New York Times about this, and they didn't put it like this, but I sort of had the feeling they were just throwing it up against the wall because nobody really knows how the business is working anymore.
Right.
They'll try anything to see if it works.
Yeah. So I think there's a few factors going on there. It's Netflix doesn't necessarily know the exhibitor business that well. They're just getting into that. But
And this was a Netflix movie.
Yes. But they have been getting a lot of Academy Award nominations the last couple of years, which was a new thing for them because they started to get into art house and more intellectual type titles and things like that. And so, but to be eligible for Academy Awards, you do have to have a play period in theaters. I'm not sure what the minimum number of screens is, but you do have to play it on a certain number of screens for it to be eligible. So that was the whole reason that Glass Onion was in theaters, was to get that eligibility. And, great, they made some money that week, but it was really about getting nominations.
Well, there was a similar situation a few years ago with Roma, because not many theaters showed it.
Right.
Dreamland did show it, I hasten to say. We were very lucky to get that.
Right.
But let's stick with art house for a moment. Art house movies are not expected to do well. Art house movies tend not to come from Disney, Universal, Paramount, et cetera,
Right.
the big studios. So how does that change how you get a hold of a movie like that for Dreamland?
Well, it's through our booker for the most part.
The same person who's doing
Yes.
stuff for Disney and so on.
Right. So, for instance, Disney owns Fox now, and Fox's independent studio is called Fox Searchlight, which does all Wes Anderson movies. A bunch of genre type films in that area, and so yeah, they are easier to book, like I said, but for the most part, they still go through the booker. And then when you get into art house, that's when, and especially if you're only doing a couple screenings or one screening, they call them a one-off, which is what Film for Thought is.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I would go directly to the distributor and the studio that's handling it and make the booking. So examples of that would be, say, A24, which has a lot of prestige horror titles, things like that. A lot of thoughtful indie dramas they produce, and so I often deal with them and other really small kind of boutique distributors who our booker doesn't really have time to deal with because he's booking, like I said, upwards of 25 theaters, and for the most part booking the same deals across the board.
As we're doing this, it's January 31st, we're doing this show. And last week at Film for Thought, it was The Eternal Daughter, which I believe was A24.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Which had Tilda Swinton, a name actress.
Right.
She does a lot of oddball things, but she is a name actress.
Right.
So it's not as if art house things are, a guy with a camera in his backyard. A lot of these art house films do have big names. And a lot of them will end up with Oscar nominations and awards.
Right. And, I think that's a big factor in how these movies get greenlit. The producers attached are people who have probably been very successful in the film industry or another industry. And, they want an Academy Award nomination. That's the goal, And if they make money, then that's, just the cherry on top. But, a lot of great movies, didn't do well at the box office or did middling and didn't bring in the big dollars, but they got recognition in award season.
A lot of what we've been talking about, I assume, will still apply to documentaries.
Yes.
Now, documentaries are not going to be Top Gun or Avatar, but a lot of them will do well in the context of low budget, low distribution. But as far as getting your hands on them, it's basically the same thing as getting, let's say, an art house.
So the same process for Eternal Daughter would be the same for a documentary. Like this Wednesday, we're playing Lowndes County, The Rise of Black Power. And that is a documentary. And I booked it the same way I would book the Eternal Daughter title. for a one-off, and then we make a deal. These types of films are on that lower end of the percentage spectrum. So, we end up paying 35-40% of each dollar that comes in back to those distributors. And then we go from there.
The last 3 summers, Dreamland had a drive-in out off of Nobodere Farm Road. How different is that from where you sit for your work?
Well, the drive-in is, it's considered not an additional screen for us. It's considered an additional theater for us. So it comes with its own set of rules. The way we have it set up is that, Dreamland charges a per car entry fee, and we don't count how many people are in the car or anything like that. It's just whoever's in the car can come in and get a spot and watch the movie. But because it's done that way, we are not allowed to play first-run films out there for the most part, which means we're playing like I said, repertory titles. So we try to pick the ones that people want to see, the ones that might lend themselves to that atmosphere. Seeing it in the great outdoors on a beautiful night. So movies that have done well there over the last 3 years have been Jaws. Twister is, funnily enough, the highest grossing drive-in film ever made. And that has proven true at Dreamland as well. It has great attendance. Mamma Mia is another one people come back for again and again. And then a lot of programming out there is just trying to pick a variety of titles that we think people will come out and see. That means a lot of family pictures because, the kids can run around and there's a lot of freedom. You're not worried about, people being quiet and things like that. It's, you kind of sit in your own car and put the radio as loud as you want, pay attention as much as you want. So it is kind of a different experience for sure. But that's the reason why it's all repertory or older titles. And if we were to try to play first-run movies out there, it would look a lot different. It would be they would make us charge per person, and we would have minimum runs just like we do at the downtown theater of roughly 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that, which would make it pretty difficult in a small town like Nantucket, a very isolated town, obviously. For that to be viable, that would be tough because a lot of people will come, interested people will come see it in the first week, and then the second week, third week is just left with a couple people each night.
Well, a lot of those drive-in titles that do so well, they wouldn't necessarily do well in the Dreamland itself.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, not in every case, but if let's say it's a rainy day,
right,
and the drive-in can't show anything,
right.
If you had a slot open, a screen open downtown,
right.
You may or may not want to do it, right?
No, I mean, like my point, I said it was funny that Twister is the number one all-time drive-in title, but if you put that in an indoor theater, that would not be the case, of course.
Yeah.
I think titles that tend to do well on the indoor are, we do community screenings from time to time, and either they have a local connection or it's just kind of a movie that everyone loves on the big screen. I think Jaws maybe transcends the different locales. But just because of our connection to that film and Nantucket's connection to that film, but it is a very different can of worms. Yeah,
and a community screening, just to extend the point, that's as far as booking things and choosing things. That's really its own category. Yeah, at least for the Dreamland.
Right. Yeah, it is.
As we're taping this, we're about 6 weeks away from the Oscars. I guess there's really no way to guess what is going to do well at the Oscars. I mean, you can make a well-educated guess, but a silly guess. But in your future booking, can you anticipate? Can you try to suss out what's going to happen and make the appropriate bookings of things that might win? Yeah.
So, I mean, the Golden Globes are a good bellwether for what might happen at the Academy Awards. And so if we are looking for titles to fit in before now and the Academy Awards, we might pick Everything Everywhere All at Once or something like that, which is another A24 movie. But that movie was large enough that our booker handled it because he was doing it, a wide scale, placement for the title. So even smaller distributors like that, they do have a sliding scale of, their big movies and then their small movies. And I believe the record still holds that that film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, is A24's highest grossing movie ever. Yeah.
Now, when a movie actually arrives at Dreamland, it's on a hard drive.
Yes.
In the old days, and I'm not sure how far back this goes, but not that far, you would get reels. Obviously, it's a lot easier to deal with the hard drive.
Right.
But I'm wondering if that has any effect on anything we've talked about today.
Yes. So reels predate my involvement in the industry. Dreamland was rebuilt reopened in 2012. So it was right during the changeover to all digital. And so, like you said, it comes in probably a 6x4 drive that has a special slot in the projector. And it's protected by a very long numbered code. And we are given a key that unlocks the drive. And that's how we play movies. The content of those drives, it's called ingestion. And so that takes several hours after we get the drive. And then at that point, we match the key with the content, and then it's available to play. And so that was referred to at the time as digital readiness. What we're experiencing now, and Dreamland, I believe, was one of the first, if not the first, theater in the country to adopt a fully digital process. So for a bunch of films now, including Disney films, we don't get drives anymore. The content for the film is delivered securely via our network in a special box in our server room. And I get an email, and our tech director, Paul Berard, gets an email when the content is ready for us to add to our projectors.
And is there a code in there that shuts the whole thing off?
That's a complicated question because Dreamland is an independent theater, and it was not built with any money from the studios. We are not monitored. So most movie theaters in the country actually have how many times the title plays, things like that. When it's playing, like they can look at a system and see what's playing where, anywhere in the country. But that's only if you borrowed money during that time, that switchover period. And if you borrowed money from the studios during that time, it came with the caveat that you must let us install this software that tracks everything you're doing. So we're grateful that we don't have to deal with that kind of micromanagement. Because Dreamland was fortunate enough to raise money, and the Nantucket community was obviously the key player in that, in making sure that the Dreamland was truly independent.
Before we go, let's talk about you as Josh Gray, not as Director of Creative Programming. When did you come to Nantucket? Why, how, et cetera?
Well, I've honestly spent most of my life here. My parents moved here when I was 6 years old. My dad worked for the post office here and was an electrician for a time. When I was a kid, he was also a minister, pastor. And so at 12 years old, we moved to Maine, where he had a church for several years. And then we lived in India. He took an interim position where we lived there for almost a year. I think around 23, I came back here. Spent 6 years at the Inquirer and Mirror as the editorial assistant, and then staff writer doing the arts and religion. And then from there, I worked with the Westmore Club as their marketing director for 4 years, and I've been with the Dreamland for about 6.5 years now. Outside of that, I've continued to write since my days at the Inquirer and Mirror. I'm a regular contributor to Nantucket Magazine, sometimes Nantucket Today, and I was a longtime columnist for Man About Town when Gene Mann was alive. And I'm also a photographer. I'm the co-president of the Photographers Association on the island. And so while that is the lesser part of my livelihood, I still try to get out there and take the shots and do some bookings there when I can. But it seems like less and less these days as Dreamland gets busier and busier post-COVID.
More full disclosure, one of your photographs is right near our front door.
I appreciate that, yes. I remember when you guys purchased that. Thank you.
It seems I'm not seeing a through line before you got to the Dreamland. I'm seeing a lot of things you did, but what prepared you to do that job?
So I initially started at Dreamland as the marketing director. Dreamland is actually where I saw my first movie as a child. While I didn't accept the role at Dreamland with film programming in mind, my conversations with the then executive director, Joe Hale, led him to appoint me as also the film programmer, just because I have a lifelong passion for film and music as well. And so I came in and, I just started talking about film right away, and he recognized that and put me in that role. And so, for the entire 6.5 years I've been at Dreamland, essentially that entire time I've been the film programmer.
And to give you a plug or give us a plug for Film for Thought, that I believe was your idea.
I believe it came about as a result of a conversation between Joe and I, and that may have stemmed from our board of directors. I'm not completely sure. But it started out, and you were involved early on, I remember. But in the beginning, before we could get digital delivery for these kind of one-off movies, we were playing movies that had just come out the day before. And we would get the Blu-ray from, an online retailer and get it and then play it that night. So it was only on video for one day. And, the goal is that we created a program that was so kind of under the wire that people would come and then they would learn to trust our programming acumen and realize that we were showing them pictures that really had potential to be remembered, you know what I mean, and nominated for these awards. And so I think you'd agree with me, over the years, we've seen a lot of the movies that play at Film for Thought nominated for major awards and win major awards.
Yes.
Part of the programming we do each year for Film for Thought, and that's coming right up in 3 weeks, is we'll have 3 weeks of the short film program, the animated, live action, and documentary nominees. And so we'll do those each week. And then the following Sunday, after the last program, is the awards. And then we get a lot of people out for those. And it's really just people wanting to be informed about what's nominated. And it gives them a kind of a title to root for in all these categories. You're
right. It is a thrill to be watching the Oscars and see Film for Thought titles either just getting nominated or winning. I mean, it really is a nice feeling to see that.
Yes, yeah.
And with Film for Thought, we sort of went over this before, but I'll put it this way. There's less pressure to find a profit-making film with Film for Thought.
Yes.
Just one show a week.
Right.
All year.
Right.
The idea is, let's show films that maybe there are 5 people in the audience, but it's a movie that people aren't going to see otherwise.
Right.
And for those 5 people, it's going to mean a hell of a lot to see that movie.
Right. And, we are a small, isolated community, as I said. And it's different for every title. I mean, like you said, some weeks, if we have a foreign language title that's, subtitled for our English speakers, that is not necessarily a big draw in January, each year on Nantucket. But, there are some titles where we get a full house, and it really is dependent on we did premiere everything everywhere all at once at Film for Thought, and then it continued to play.
Yes, it became part of the regular run.
Yeah, because we had a great turnout. And so we'll often do that. If a Film for Thought title has a really great response, we'll try to play it 3 or 4 more times over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah.
Josh Gray, thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
I think the audience heard a lot of things that they would never have dreamed about.
I hope
But it is not a simple thing just to, you don't call 1-800-MOVIE and have a movie delivered the next day. I mean, it's a negotiation.
It is.
I think most people have no idea that that's the case.
Yeah.
Thanks for explaining it.
Absolutely.
For Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for tuning in, and please tune in again.